Hello everyone, this is Mike, and I wanted to do a little video. I've been asked this before, and I've seen other people ask, and let me double check that everything is working correctly. Okay, uh, looks like it. Okay. Um, when it comes to ratings in, it could be anything, sports games, dice games, um, it could be real-time strategy, any of that. Well, how in the world do they come up with ratings, especially something like sports games? Well, just as a for starters, is probably very obvious, but the biggest thing is simply put, it's opinion. It's straight up opinion. And just a little background: I've been making sports, uh, mainly football teams, since the '90s. I got the bug back in actually my college days. It was the late 80s. A friend of mine introduced me to a game called Super Sunday, which was, I know it was out on the PC, but I was initially playing it on Commodore 64. And it was a number based, stats based game with some ratings, but it was mainly numbers. And you would coach, there was no controller, joystick, or anything like that. And that introduced me into it. Now, the company was Avalon Hill, and they didn't advertise it, but you could, if you called the company, the programmers made a Team Maker disc. And I'm not referring to those who remember the game, the General Manager disc. I'm not referring to that. That was sold in stores. It was to make teams. And so I started making teams for that game, and I put it on Genie, which is General Electric's online service. You know, back in the days of America Online, CompuServe, and I might have put it on one or both of them as well. I can't remember. So I did that, and I also made teams for Front Page Sports Football, and released them. And there was an article in Computer Gaming World about them. I released like Super Bowl teams, and I had a friend who was also releasing modern day teams at the time. I also made some teams for micro league football after the NFL Pro League football days, when the engine became Pro League football. So I've actually spoken with programmers, spoken with companies, um, and gotten an idea about how some of these things are done. What you see on your screen right now is an example I wanted to start with. Um, you see on, uh, make it a little more, so cut off one of those, the one in the back, I'll get to that later. You'll see on the left and the right the 1976 Oakland Raiders. This is their roster from the game NFL Challenge. The one on the left is from the NFL Dream Season disc. The one on the right of the Raiders is from the Greatest Teams disc, which had the greatest single season team from each franchise. Now, if you look at Kenny Stabler, and you look at his pass rating and his run rating, you'll see his run rating on the left is for the Dream Season disc is an 80, and his pass is 97. But if you look at the disc, the file that came with the Greatest Teams disc, you'll see his running has gone down to a 67, and his passing has gone from a 97 to a 93. So a long time ago, I actually called the company and asked, did you guys make a mistake? Because these numbers don't jive between the two leagues. And the response I got was, well, they're two different seasons, and they're facing different teams. So they were made based on how they would compare on the left with some other all time great teams from the NFL Dream Season, and on the right with the greatest teams disc. So the ratings don't jive. They weren't built on like a global scale. They were designed for the given teams in question. So that's the way I do know some games are built is for who their competition is. And some games do build them blanket, you know, we consider everything on an all-time scale so you can play interchange between leagues. I do know that the gentleman who made NFL Pro League football, he told me that, and this makes sense, for the best results when you're playing any kind of game like this, it could be, doesn't have to be football, it could be baseball, it could be whatever. You're gonna get the best results when you play inside the given season in question, because that's really where everything is based. Now, can you physically play in between? Sure. But even on an all-time scale, you might not get an entirely accurate representation of a result. Um, and the games change. I mean, especially like football. I mean, if you were to take a team from the '70s and put them against a team nowadays, uh, nowadays because it's so geared towards offense, the offense is probably going to light them up. So you have to take that into consideration for from a realistic aspect. Uh, so what somebody might do is code these older teams to maybe have better endurance or maybe be tougher on the line or whatever to try to compete. So again, it's all opinion. And as you can see, NFL Challenge, here's a prime example right in front of you. You can look at other ratings for other players, and you will see there's they're slightly they're different numbers. Now, since we're talking about NFL Challenge, it actually said in the documentation. You'll notice they have position, height, weight, years. Um, you'll have speed. That's what they did in the 40-yard dash. You have a run, receive, block, pass, and kick rating for everybody blanket. Now, you'll see that the numbers go between 50 and 99. It even says in their documentation the reason that the ratings are all between 50 and 99 for everybody. And their logic was anybody can make a play, 50-50, and nobody is perfect, capped at 99. So different engines use different methods for how they play the game. Now, back to Super Sunday. When I was making teams for that, I noticed that if you just playing the game in general, it was very difficult to run. You would run about, if your running back ran an average of 4 yards a carry, I'm fine. He's going to run 2.5 in a game. And it didn't matter what team. And it didn't matter how great your call was. It was kind of hard to run on that game. It was either a very small gain or a huge gain. So what I did was when I made those, there was actually a actual team number for average yards allowed on defense. What I did is I cheated when I built those teams and I doubled that number. So if your defense allowed 3.5 yards to run on average, I doubled it to 7. And the funny thing is, when you played against that team, your player that was running was ballpark the average of what they did in real life. So, and that was just by experience. That was just the nature of the engine of the game. So, when you make ratings, you need to consider the game itself, the engine, and you have to really play around with it. There's no definitive answer. You've got to see how the engine works and compare it to the ratings you're putting in. Then you may have to up a rating here, down a rating there, and it's a real juggling act. Now, I'll tell you straight up, when it comes to ratings, are you going to get 100% right? No, you never will. It's beyond impossible. Don't try. Try to make ratings for your teams, or if you're playing like I love the Command and Conquer series. I love Red Alert. I love Generals. I love Command and Conquer. I do know that the programmers, from what I read, was like the GLA was just way too powerful. Some of the units were just way too powerful. So the programmers dumbed down the units to make it more of an through patches to make those units more equal around the board. They were just too powerful. So they modified the ratings for their various units. So, and they did it after the fact through fan, request. So there's so many factors in building this stuff that it's not just a one and done. It's a lot of work. So I'm going to slide this over a little bit, and what you'll see on the left now is the 76 Raiders, how I entered them in for Pro Strategy Football. Now, um, you'll see that there's different data. They have an age where NFL Challenge didn't. They have jersey numbers. NFL Challenge didn't. NFL Challenge had a height, weight, and years. Pro Strategy Football actually does have years. It just doesn't show up here. And they have a block rating, which looks like the block rating is blanket on the right for NFL Challenge, where Pro Strategy Football has a run and pass blocking rating. And if you look at the ratings, they're all within the 90s for the entire offensive line for NFL Challenge. And on the left, you've got nines and eights and 1-7, the backup for the 76 Raiders on the Pro Strategy Football game. Now, I made those. I didn't reference NFL Challenge when making it. Um, that being said, it's a different engine, so it's going to give me spit out different results. So, for example, passing, I've got a rating of 7 for Kenny Stabler, and it's a scale of 1 to 9 for Pro Strategy Football. Here they've got him at a 97. And the other version, what was it, a 93? A 93, yeah. Um, so you got to play with the engine. What I have found with Pro Strategy Football, to let anyone know, is when it comes to accuracy, and this is just from toying around, um, if you put in a 3, 4, 5, one of those numbers, it's approximately on average 30, 40, 50%, give or take. So if your quarterback, especially back, I'm building 50s teams, if your quarterback is throwing 30 something percent, then you probably want to make his accuracy a 3. And that's just a ballpark. Now, once you get into sixes and above, no one throws 99%, so a 9 would not be 99%. You would, at least with Pro Strategy Football, you would take into consideration, how many yards. You add that to his strength. How many touchdowns, how few picks, that kind of stuff, and then you would up it that way. So someone like Kurt Warner or Dan Marino is going to be 9s because they're just insanely powerful, not just with their accuracy, but everything else. It's a juggling game, and you'll never get it 100% right. Um, as an example, when I made a batch of teams for Front Page Sports Football back in the 90s, I had someone complain to me about the 68 Jets because they thought that the data I entered in for Joe Namath's speed was too slow. And I noted, well, I had to take into consideration he had bum knees. And their argument was, yes, he did have bum knees, but he wasn't this slow. So it's a juggling act. You're never going to make everybody happy, and you will never be happy building these things. It's always going to have some kind of anomaly. It's always going to be off a little bit. So you have to take all that into consideration. You have to know the engine. It's not just building the range. You have to know the engine of the given game you're working with. And if you're doing this like a mod, like I did here for Pro Strategy Football, um, if the programmer has built it this way, etched in stone, then you're going to have to make your ratings based around what the game does, because you can't go in there and crack into the game. And I'm not suggesting you do, but and I'm not talking about modders who crack games so that they can make new graphics or something like that. I'm not out to do any of that. Um, looking at the stock game, it is what it is. So you have to figure out whatever the good, the bad, the quirks, the exploits, or whatever, and utilize your ratings to try to emulate that. Now, what do you do for research? If you're building a team like this, how in the world, where do you get your information? How in the world do you try to figure out ratings? And every game has different elements in it. Well, I can give you three suggestions. For starters, if you have other games similar to what you are using, um, I'm not saying run out and buy them, but if you call this up, hey there, Al. Um, the three college teams I made had a lot of fun. Yeah, and it's work, isn't it? It's work. Um, you have to make the yep. You have to make the ratings around the game engine and work with it. That is absolutely right. Um, um, oh, now I lost my train of thought. Let's see. Where was I? Let me see if I can remember by looking up. Well, the places you can do to get your ratings base. Um, Again, if you happen to have other games uh, of a similar type, look at their ratings as maybe a starting point. And if you try to put in those ratings, you're going to find some of them might work and some of them are just disastrously wrong for the game you're playing. So you're going to have to manipulate it. It's trial and error. When it comes to sports, I'll give you a football example. Let's say you wanted to build pro football team. Uh, there are two websites I highly recommend. One is called Pro Football Reference, and you can look up your team and you want to type in the given year. So let's say 1985 Bears. It'll show you everything about the Bears, all their stats, um, their lineup, starters, etc. Uh, but I have found with at least, and this is weird, at least with the field goal long from your place kicker, it doesn't list that. There is a web page that does, and it's called footballdb.com, as in football database. If you do a search for the team, or you can actually sometimes search for just the player's name, it lists the same information as Pro Football Reference, but it also lists the longest kick that they made. So I like to go in between the two. Um, if I normally just default to Pro Football Reference, but I know I'm going to end up going to Football Database for the long field goal kick. Now, you also run into situations if you're doing something, if you're trying to build ratings off of stats, which you can do, um, or if you actually, this is one of those number cruncher games where you actually put in the actual stats, you will find in some statistical categories that come with your game, either they didn't exist at the given time, the given year in question that you're entering, or there is no stat. They don't keep records of it, or it's not freely available, one or the other. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Sacks. If you're doing a game that has sacks by an individual player, sacks were not recorded as an actual statistic until the 1982 season, the first strike season. That is where stats are registered by the NFL. Another example is I know in Pro Strategy Football there is a stat for your kickers. The average kickoff distance that they kick the ball. So if they're on average kicking 60.2%, that's an actual statistic that's used in Pro Strategy Football. Problem with this is that was not a statistic that was kept record of until 1993. So now you've got no sacks until 1982, and you've got no kicker average kickoff distance before 1993. So what do? Well, you don't have a choice. You have nothing to go off base wise. So it's going to have to be fictional. And there's no two ways around it. It's going to have to be fictional. You just have to make it up. Now, you could just do a rubber stamp number if you wanted. Now, when I run to that, I normally go 60 for the kickoff because that's basically kicking it to the end zone. When it comes to sacks, all you can do is look at a history of the team and a history of the players and try to distribute. If you're putting in actual sack statistical numbers, which Pro Strategy Football, for example, doesn't, but I've seen games that do, you're just gonna you just have to distribute them. Now, in some cases, they actually kept track of sacks as a team statistic versus an individual. So what you could do is you could take the team statistic of how many sacks the team had, figure out which of the players on your defense, the line, the linebackers, the secondary, were the better ones, and distribute them so that that number equals what the team did. It, there's no right or wrong answer. So um, it's all just using your best interpretation. So I'll tell you that if you make any kind of team season whatever and you release it, um, just as a note to you, be prepared to, in some cases, have some harsh criticism. And because it's impossible to make everybody happy, don't try. Make yourself happy. Offer something to the public that they're going to enjoy. And smile about it and enjoy your day. And I mean, I haven't I've received criticism, sure, but it's normally nitpicky stuff. So I'm just forewarning you, if you release it, you could encounter that. But I've been doing this for decades, and I thought I was done. To be honest with you, um, I was done in the '90s, and I did some in the 2000s for my own fun. But when Pro Strategy Football was released, and I saw it grow, I saw it have potential. I saw a door open there, and no, I'm not retired, if you will, but I came out of retirement building these teams, and I'd like to finish it and then just call it. So, that being said, you're going to have to take into consideration also, especially with some of these older teams, there's not a whole lot of information available, or maybe there's some statistics weren't recorded. And I will tell you, I know that in the 50s, I've run into and the 60s, I've run into situations where um, a kicker or a kick returner or a punt returner, it had the number of kicks or punts that they returned, but it didn't have yardage. It didn't have average. It might have had the average, but it didn't have number of touchdowns. It didn't have other. Some teams kept some numbers and some teams didn't, and I found that out like in the 50s and 60s. Uh, so there's no record of it. So how do you build a kick returner or a punt returner off that without complete records? Well, you can't. You just have to extrapolate, make it up, and do the best you can. You're not going to get it right, but who can call you on it because there's nothing to go off of? So you just have to use your best judgment for the team in question or the player in question. Now, one thing I did was when I started building these teams for this game, for Pro Strategy Football, I want to do research. So one of the things I did was forget statistics, forget numbers, forget all of that. As an example, I looked up who had the best offensive lines in history. So I got like the Raiders from the 70s, the Hogs from the Redskins, um, Green Bay, the Cowboys from the 90s, from the first half of the 90s, things like that. So I made notes on this and I deliberately kept a record of this. And when I went to build those teams, I took into consideration these facts, and I may have juiced them up because I also wanted to consider history. Like the linebackers from the Steelers from the 90s, the first half of the 90s were, epic. So were the Broncos from the back half of the 70s, their linebacker core, things like that. So, you also consider if someone's a Hall of Famer or they had that one breakout year, you might juice them up for that given year, that kind of thing. So it's all just open to interpretation. So one thing I'll say is I'd like to try this maybe in another video, but put up. I would actually like to construct a team that people absolutely have heard of, even if they may not know them in and out. I want to build on a spreadsheet, on a stream like this, the 85 Bears, and show you exactly what I go through in pro strategy football. And that way give you an idea of how in depth this is and maybe answer questions or what have you. So uh, the I'm currently building, maybe it'll be out today, the 1956 NFL. This was the year the Giants won the NFL title. It was the only time they won it in the 50s. So I just wanted to, you know, talk about this in case anybody's asking, questions about, how do you go through all this, what's involved, that kind of thing. Um, Also, I want to note, I'll give you another example. I know that game programmers also sometimes modify their engines in later releases to take things into consideration. I'll give you an example. Um, NFL Pro League football in the late 80s, it was a DOS game. I remember looking at the rating. It was a number cruncher game like Second and 10 is now. I remember looking at, but it actually generates a rating via whatever the real life statistics are. The 89 49ers, I looked at Joe Montana and Steve Young's passing rating overall. Joe Montana was a 100. Steve Young was a 95, and I remember that. I remember being in college and laughing with the guy. I was like, well, wow, if Montana gets hurt, his backup is better than almost anybody else in the league. So, it's great for the 49ers if you're coaching them. And then in the later release, I remember looking at the statistics, and Montana had dropped down a little bit, and so did Steve Young. And I knew the program, and I asked them, well, why it's the same numbers, why did their ratings go down a little bit? I mean, it wasn't like massive, but Montana wasn't a perfect 100 anymore. And basically what I was told was, well, I redid the ratings. Um, I redid my formula for the ratings. So even programmers go in and they mess around with even things that are factual to try to make the game a little better and possibly incorporate other leagues if you're playing an interleague game. So again, I'll note that, and I've heard this more than once, um, that if you're playing any kind of game like this, it doesn't matter the sport. If you're playing teams against each other, you tend to get more realistic results if you're playing in the given season in question than if you do uh, between time. Someone from the 50s against someone from the 90s or whatever, you're going to tend to get more realistic results. And that's just the nature of the beast. And even if you try to build it for taking into all decades into consideration. So, uh, anyway, yeah, I'll put it in the chat. It should be footballdb.com. FootballDB short for database. So that has some numbers that were missed by Pro Football Reference. But again, Pro Football Reference is the one to go to. So, all right, just wanted to jump on in case anybody had any questions. If you wanted to build your own, it's all opinion. It's all opinion, and I don't care what Madden, the people who make Madden, those ratings are all opinion. No one's going to tell it's a human being typing in a rating number or typing in stats to have maybe some kind of algorithm generate a rating. But even the programmer who made the algorithm to generate the rating is still using his or her opinion to generate that rating from the numbers. So what's the difference? So it's all opinion. Bottom line. Actually, one final thing. This is what I wanted to mention. This is what had slipped on. I noticed, and some people have asked this. Well, when you made teams for Pro Strategy Football, and I actually had somebody complain on a live stream that, well, I see that you guys are playing this game online, you're calling the game, and I see this person as a tight end, but in real life they were a wide receiver or they were a running back. Well, that's not historically accurate. What are you doing? Uh, well, the reason that kind of stuff happens is because you run into the limitations of the given game in question, what their engine is built for. And some of these older teams had a bunch of running backs, but like three or four wide receivers and no tight end. Or say they were like the '93 Oilers, who was built for this for Pro Strategy Football. They didn't have tight ends at all. They had all wide receivers, and it was a run and shoot game. Well, the way that the roster is set up for Pro Strategy Football is, at least right now, and I know the program is working on 53-man rosters. Uh, there are two quarterbacks, there are four running backs, two halfbacks, and two fullbacks. There are three tight ends. There are a total of five receivers. You've got three wideouts and two split ends. Period. There's no two ways around it. So you have to, when you run into a situation when you've got that, and you don't have enough players in a slot for, say, tight ends. I'm using the Houston Oilers from Warren Moon's era as an example. But you got receivers at the wazoo. Okay, well, you don't have enough receivers you have more than enough receivers to fill in all those slots, and you got a bunch of spares, but you've got nothing for tight ends. So what I did was, okay, wide receiver one is their top receiver, had the most receptions. Split end one, who always gets the second amount of passes, um, is wide receiver who caught the second amount. Okay, tight end one is normally who the game by engine design goes third for. Well, I put in wide receiver number three, whatever receiver caught the third amount of catches. Now, was this player tight end? No. Did I put in like decent blocking ability? No. I took into consideration it's a wide receiver, so that person's not going to be able to block very well. But if their default is a three wide out, there's your third wide out by using a standard formation. Now, you go four wide outs, then you go to one of the other receivers, and so you have to take those things into consideration. And then you also run into the opposite where, well, I don't have enough receivers. I have one tight end, and I have three receivers, and I've got all these slots to fill in, and I got a team from the 50s. Okay, well, I've got extra running backs. I only have four running back slots. So after I fill in the top four running backs, and I fill in all the receivers and that one tight end, now I'm going to look at the running backs that actually had statistics. And I'm not looking at how many times they ran. I'm looking at how many times they caught a ball. And then I'm doing the math. Well, who had the most? Okay, well, they're the next wide receiver. And the person after that, they're the next tight end. The person after, they're the next wide receiver. And I shoved them in there so that historically they're in the game. They're not the right positions. They may have been a running back that had 20 runs, but I've got them in as wide receiver three because that's the slot they can fit in. So, and it won't just be receivers. I found that for offensive linemen, defensive linemen, linebackers, defensive backs. I've had to put a defensive lineman as a backup defensive back because they existed, but there were no more other defensive backs. The alternative is I just named the slot after the position in question, but I make it obvious that this is fictional. As Al likes to joke about, I know that Ron did too, DB6. I put that in when there's no slot for that person whatsoever. There was no one that could fill that role. So I named them DB6, which is what the position is. And I put in a generic rating for them. Or I put in a rating that was consistent with their secondary so that there's some realism to it. But you know when playing that person, that there's no way to fill that slot. Now I could have put in a fictional name, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to make people aware when they're playing the game. Oh, there was no linebacker, number 5. They only had the 4 linebackers, and that was it. Uh, that way, you know the historical. Now, and that's open to interpretation. If you want to name there is no DB6, and you want to name the person John Smith, go ahead. I mean, it's not wrong. It's just my method of how I did it. So I tried to put in realism and logic into the equation, and you can do the same kind of thing as well. Um, so it's when you run into a situation when you've got a roster set up that's concrete, etched in stone, it has to be this way, and you have a roster that you're trying to build historically correct. You're going to run into situations like this where, okay, well, where do I go? I mean, what can I do? I gotta go somewhere with this. So there's no wrong answer. um, you just have to do your best to try to weigh the pros and the cons. And I'll add this as well: 85 Bears, since I mentioned them. I cheated on that team in the NFL 100. Fullback number 2 is not, I want to say it was Matsui. I can't remember who it was. I could be wrong in the name. Um, well, I know people wanted to play this for historical, not just accuracy, but for fun. So what I did was, even though he didn't have nearly as many carries as fullback 2, I cheated by putting in William the Refrigerator Perry as fullback number 2. So if you get to the goal line and you're coaching and you want the fun of trying to have the fridge hammer it home and get a touchdown, you can. Now, I took that given fullback in question, and there was a spare tight end or wide receiver, something like that. Well, I dropped the player in there so that the player actually exists in the roster. So I've run into situations where I've cheated like that for, in the context of, having fun. Someone's going to be looking like, this wasn't the case for the 95 Cowboys. The number of catches actually equated, but if it didn't, Deion Sanders was sometimes used as a wide receiver. You gotta put him in there, even if he's like the wide receiver number 3 backup to a backup. You gotta put him in there because somebody's gonna want to throw the ball at Deion Sanders. 95 Steelers. Even though there were plenty of slots, Rod Woodson was out week 1, and it was supposed to be on injured reserve. They didn't put him on injured reserve. They held him in case they made the Super Bowl. Well, they did. And so even though he didn't start, Rod Woodson was in the game. So what I did was, when I made the 95 Steelers, I put in DB6 as Rod Woodson and rated him through the roof. So that way people who wanted Rod Woodson and knew that team could actually use him. All right. Well, anyway, I got to run. The wife and kids just showed up, and I was trying to sneak this in without being disturbed. And now, hi, Philip. All right. My kids are home. Got to go. Bye.